But when we're talking about powers of I, oops. All right, so if we have I to the first power, that just simplifies to be I. If we have I to the second power, well, at the very beginning we said that we're going to call I squared -1, right? Whenever we see an I squared, we'll simplify that to be -1. I to the third power, right? To get that, that's I times I times I, or if we do things in the form of I squared, that's I squared times I. Right, well, we already know I squared is -1. -1 times I gives me a -I. Right, so I to the third is -I. And then I to the fourth would be the same thing as saying I squared times I squared. And -1 times -1 gives you a +1. So I want you to notice these answers here. So we've got I, -1, -I, and +1. Okay, so these are the 4 answers that those simplified to be. Now, if I repeat this pattern, or if I keep going and figure out what I to the 5th is, I to the 6th, I to the 7th, and I to the 8th, right, what these simplify to be, I'll see that they simplify to be these same things, right, in this same order. So this is saying, so I to the 5th would be the same thing as I squared squared, so that's I to the 4th times another I, right? Well, -1 all squared is 1 times I is I, right? So I get that same thing. Right, so I to the 1st was I to the 5th is I. If I go to I to the 6th, well, that's the same thing as saying I squared raised to the 3rd power, right? I could rewrite it that way. And that would say -1 raised to the 3rd power, right, would just be -1. Okay, so I can see, yep, I get that same thing there. I to the 7th, right? That would be, you know, I squared to the 3rd times by another I, because that's I to the 6th times I. So that's going to give me my -I. And then I to the 8th would be I squared all raised to the 4th power. Well, -1 raised to an even power is just going to give you a +1. All right, so this is called a cyclical group where they can all simplify to be, you know, one of these 4 things. And it's always going to go in that order. So the I, -1, -I, 1. I, -1, -I, 1. All right, so remembering this order could be really helpful in figuring out some of these that maybe are larger powers. So if I'm asked to simplify I to the 30th power, right? I could do all this, you know, writing them out in different forms like this, or I know that there's one of 4 answers I'm going to get. And so if I take 4, right, the 4, because there's 4 different possibilities, and divide it into 30, well, 4 divides into 30 7 times, and I don't care about how many times it goes in. What I care about is the remainder. So I'm left with a remainder of 2, right? And when I have a remainder of 2, that's going to correspond with these over here. So let me write this down. So if I have a remainder of 1, I'll always have I for my answer. If I have a remainder of 2, I'll have -1 as my answer. If I have a remainder of 3, I'll have a -I. And then if it divides in evenly, so this is a remainder of 0, right? Or it just divides evenly, then you'll get 1 for your answer. Right? And those are the only possibilities of what you could have on this when you divide 4 into any number. Okay, so let's try it on another example here. So why don't you figure out, try these two. So I to the 75th power, and then also do I to the 64th power. Okay. So this one, whoops, I forgot to put over here. Since it was a remainder of 2, that means my answer is -1. Right. Okay, so go ahead and do those other two. Okay, so when you did that I to the 75th power, right, 4 divides into 75 18 times, but we don't care about how many times it divides in. We care about this remainder down here. So we have a remainder of 3, right? And so that corresponds with, that means it must be a -I, is how that would simplify. So -I would be my answer there. Okay, what did you guys come up with for I to the 64th power? Anybody have it yet?
1.
Okay, you guys came up with 1, right? Because when you do this, 4 divides into 64, right? And so when we do this division here, we see, oh, look at this. It divides in evenly. It leaves a 0 remainder. Right? And so when our remainder is 0, that's going to correspond with our answer simplifying to be 1. Okay, so this is just another way that you can look at it where you're just doing this division. The other way is that you can just, write these as many powers of, 2 as you can, because we know that I squared does equal -1. And so that's why we could write them out this way. But either way is great. Whatever way, kind of works better for you. That's what I always want you to use.